In 395 AD, the Roman Empire, despite its apparent might, was already showing the first alarming cracks. On its western borders, barbarian tribes increasingly encroached on imperial territory, while in the east, the young Emperor Arcadius, barely 18, sat on the throne in Constantinople. Insecure, inexperienced, and physically frail, he presented an ideal target for those who yearned to rule the empire from behind his back. It was during this period that a figure, seemingly entirely unsuited for the role, emerged from among the many contenders for power. This was no celebrated general nor an aristocrat with ancient roots, but a man marked by a physical disability and long years of service. His name was Eutropius. Lacking noble birth and the ability to have heirs, he managed to reach unprecedented heights, surpassing all his predecessors. He became the consul of the Eastern Roman Empire, effectively becoming the arbiter of destinies at the imperial court. But how did he achieve this? How did a eunuch manage to gain control over armies, issue laws, and manipulate the emperor himself? This is a story of a dizzying ascent founded on cunning and intrigue, and an equally swift and brutal fall, which forever remained in the annals of Rome as a warning to future generations. In January 395, the death of Emperor Theodosius the Great shook the foundations of the empire to its core. With his passing, the last ruler capable of holding the vast Roman machine together disappeared. His final political act was to divide power between his two sons. Honorius, still very young, received the Western Roman Empire with its capital in Ravenna. Arcadius, slightly older than his brother, but completely unprepared for military affairs, inherited the Eastern throne in Constantinople. The rift between father and son was gaping. Theodosius, a warrior emperor who felt at home on the battlefield and in religious disputes, and Arcadius, lacking the firmness and resolve necessary for rule, represented two different poles. The court instantly recognized this. The young, timid emperor, devoid of will, became a godsend for those who dreamed of governing the empire from the shadows. In Constantinople, the ensuing power vacuum acted like a magnet, attracting numerous rivals. Generals craved influence, officials fiercely vied for control over financial flows, and the palace eunuchs, like serpents, wove their treacherous intrigues. Among this constellation of schemers, one stood out, possessing a gift for unerringly reading others' weaknesses: Eutropius, the head of the imperial chancery. The stage was set. Arcadius sat on the throne, but the real games were being played behind his back. And on this chessboard of intrigues, Eutropius prepared for his first triumphant move. 10 years earlier, before entering the labyrinths of power in Constantinople, Eutropius was merely an unnamed boy from a remote village in Asia Minor. His fate took a drastic turn when he fell into the hands of slave traders. In the eastern markets, he underwent a horrific operation that determined his future life: castration. In the value system of the late Roman Empire, this tragedy set him apart into a special caste. Eunuchs were considered ideal servants at court because, deprived of the ability to have a family and heirs, they were generally believed to have no dynastic ambitions. This perceived neutrality made them indispensable as keepers of secrets, managers of wealth, and intermediaries between the emperor and the court. However, in reality, the position of a eunuch transformed into a powerful instrument of political influence. Lacking family ties and heirs, they found the meaning of their existence in accumulating power. Eutropius realized this pattern in his youth. He skillfully created the impression of a submissive and loyal servant, a man devoid of personal ambition, while simultaneously honing his skills of listening, observing, and remembering. In the atmosphere of palace intrigues, where every gesture could be interpreted as treason, he learned to act imperceptibly, like a shadow, always present, but never posing a threat. During the reign of Theodosius I, he earned the trust of influential officials due to his ability to resolve matters efficiently. But his true gift lay in his ability to discern human weaknesses. He unerringly identified whom to flatter, whom to show deference, and when it was best to remain in the shadows. After Theodosius's death, Arcadius inherited the Eastern throne. Eutropius understood that his moment had arrived. The new emperor, lacking confidence and strength of character, desperately needed someone to take on the burden of decision-making. Eutropius, combining cunning with a show of modesty, was ready to step into this role. In 395 AD, when Arcadius ascended the imperial throne, he was barely 18 years old. He inherited an empire from his father, Theodosius the Great, an empire engulfed in crisis, besieged by barbarian tribes, and torn by internal strife. However, Arcadius did not possess his father's warlike spirit and lacked sufficient political experience. His nature was gentle and timid. He preferred the comfort of palace gardens and the pomp of ceremonies to the harsh duties of a ruler. It was into this power vacuum that the figure of Eutropius emerged. From the outset, this eunuch understood that the most effective way to manage the young emperor was not through brute force or direct confrontation, but through subtle psychological manipulation. During audiences, he skillfully presented two seemingly obvious options, simplifying complex issues to a level of understandable choice. He did this with such finesse that Arcadius genuinely believed he was making independent decisions, when in reality he was merely echoing what had been pre-planned by his cunning advisor. Eutropius also cleverly played on Arcadius's personal fears, his dread of appearing weak, and the obsessive idea that he might be surpassed by more capable individuals. Whenever a general or senator attempted to influence the emperor, Eutropius subtly reminded him of the possibility of manipulation, reinforcing in his mind the thought that he, Eutropius, was his most loyal protector. Soon, Arcadius lost faith in all opinions save one. Although generals addressed the emperor, their proposals underwent changes as they passed through Eutropius. Senators arrived from Rome itself, yet their requests first reached the all-powerful eunuch. Even imperial speeches, intended to demonstrate firmness, were meticulously prepared and edited under his watchful control. To the public and nobility, Arcadius appeared as a confident ruler, but behind this carefully constructed image lay the reality. The entirety of power was concentrated in the hands of a man who had never held a weapon or commanded troops, a eunuch who discreetly managed a vast empire from behind the scenes. Eutropius's rise seemed unstoppable, but within the palace walls a force was gradually maturing, ready to challenge his influence. In April 395, Arcadius married Eudoxia, daughter of the Frankish general Flavius Bauto. Young, ambitious, and endowed with political acumen inherited from her father, the empress was unwilling to be merely an ornament to the throne. Eutropius believed he had acquired another puppet in his political game. He personally facilitated this union, confident that Eudoxia would be an obedient wife, a foreigner grateful for her newfound grandeur and entirely dependent on his guidance. However, he underestimated her indomitable political temperament and carefully calculated strategy. During her first months in the palace, Eudoxia exercised extreme caution and observation. She witnessed how every decision made by Emperor Arcadius underwent thorough scrutiny and approval by Eutropius, the all-powerful eunuch who effectively governed the empire. Courtiers seemed to regard Eutropius as the true ruler, and Arcadius himself, as the empress noted, merely echoed others' thoughts and ideas, devoid of independent thought. During quiet private dinners, Eudoxia began subtly to sow seeds of doubt in her husband's mind. By asking seemingly innocent questions, she persistently demanded explanations regarding the intricacies of tax policy, troop deployment, and the terms of international treaties. Arcadius, genuinely attempting to provide answers, realized with dismay that he possessed no arguments or knowledge of his own, but merely blindly followed the instructions of the all-powerful eunuch. The empress avoided direct confrontations with her husband, preferring a more subtle strategy. Instead of openly attacking Eutropius, she skillfully proposed alternative solutions, presented letters from influential merchants, conveyed complaints from noble senatorial families, and shared the concerns of high-ranking military officials. Her main goal was not Eutropius's immediate overthrow, but rather a gradual awakening in the emperor of the feeling that his cunning advisor was deliberately concealing important information from him, manipulating his decisions. The first open conflict between the emperor and his favorite occurred in 397, when Eutropius proposed a dubious agreement with Alaric, leader of the warlike Visigoths, granting them extensive lands in exchange for an ephemeral peace. Arcadius, influenced by doubts skillfully sown by his wife, decided to consult experienced generals and openly question the wisdom of Eutropius's proposal. The noticeable irritation that flickered across the eunuch's face became his fatal error. For the first time in a long while, the emperor saw in Eutropius not an all-powerful advisor, but a man who disrespected his supreme authority. From this moment, their relationship began to change rapidly. Arcadius increasingly sought advice directly from his astute wife and certain trusted officers, while Eudoxia, in turn, skillfully used every opportunity to gradually weaken the eunuch's influence over the emperor. What had seemed like Eutropius's unshakable power began to crumble rapidly before their eyes. Blinded by overconfidence and a belief in his invulnerability, Eutropius failed to recognize in time the true threat, which came not from disgruntled army officials or scheming senators, but from a woman who knew her husband better than anyone else. In 399, Eutropius reached the pinnacle of his political career, unaware that this was the beginning of his downfall. After years of managing from behind the scenes, Eutropius made a decision full of risk and ambition. He intended to become consul of the Eastern Roman Empire. The consulship, historically reserved for senators of ancient lineage or celebrated military commanders, was the pinnacle of the Roman political system. A eunuch's aspiration to this high office seemed like political sacrilege, yet Eutropius understood there was no direct legal prohibition. It was a challenge to established tradition, not a legal norm. For several months, he meticulously prepared the ground for his triumph. First, in private conversations with Arcadius, he presented his idea as an act of gratitude for unwavering loyalty. Then, launching a secret campaign among courtiers and jurists, he began to argue that his appointment would symbolize a new era, where personal merit was valued above birth. Arcadius hesitated, but eventually agreed. At a solemn ceremony in Constantinople, Eutropius was elevated to consular dignity, causing shock across the empire. The Roman Senate dispatched a protest filled with indignation. Generals in the corridors discussed the breach of tradition, and the populace was divided between astonishment and outrage. For Eutropius, this was his greatest triumph. Clad in the consular toga, he paraded through the palace corridors, confident in his invulnerability. However, he did not realize that this elevation marked the beginning of his downfall. By becoming consul, he ceased to be merely an influential advisor, transforming into a figure who had challenged all strata of society. He now bore responsibility for military and financial decisions, and every mistake was immediately associated with his name. Eudoxia, who had hitherto shown caution, realized the need for more energetic action. The consulship, conceived as the apex of his power and influence in the empire, became an arena where the precariousness of his position was fully exposed. The triumph, which seemed the culmination of a career full of intrigues and machinations, turned into a trap foreshadowing an inevitable fall. The summer of 399 was marked by an event that revealed Eutropius's true vulnerability. In Phrygia, in western Asia Minor, a revolt erupted led by Tribigild, an Ostrogothic general in imperial service. Initially sparked by discontent over unfair land distribution and delayed pay, this uprising quickly escalated into a widespread rebellion, threatening to destabilize the entire eastern part of the Roman Empire. Eutropius, having just been vested with consular dignity, misjudged the seriousness of the threat. Confident that he was facing only a minor display of dissatisfaction, he ordered negotiations to begin instead of preparing a decisive military response. He dispatched envoys with promises of minor concessions, naively believing he could quell the rebellion without showing signs of weakness. Tribigild, the barbarian leader, proved himself not merely a warrior, but also a shrewd strategist, skillfully exploiting court disputes for his own ends. With disdain, he rejected the empire's offer and executed the imperial envoy, which was a resounding blow to Constantinople. This act of barbarian audacity, humiliating the empire and its representative, the consul, undermined confidence in Eutropius. Roman generals, already dissatisfied with the eunuch's directives, accused him of incompetence, and popular rumor attributed the empire's misfortunes to the wrath of the gods, angered by such a man's elevation to the consulship. Empress Eudoxia skillfully exploited Eutropius's every mistake. In private conversations with Arcadius, she did not resort to direct accusations, but merely pointed to alarming reports of defeats, streams of refugees from ravaged cities, and senators' demands for decisive action. Gradually, in Arcadius's mind, a connection solidified between the empire's failures and Eutropius's influence. Tribigild's rebellion grew, cities surrendered one after another, soldiers deserted, and the imperial treasury was depleted amidst failed military campaigns. Political pressure reached a critical point. Eutropius, recently clad in the purple toga, a symbol of his omnipotence, found himself isolated, becoming a scapegoat. The man whose weapons were intrigue and cunning now faced an enemy for the first time that could neither be deceived nor bribed: open war, bringing him inevitable doom. The autumn of 399 marked the fateful demise of the all-powerful Eutropius. Failures in the struggle against Tribigild multiplied, and public indignation in Constantinople reached boiling point. The crowd, which had recently gazed in astonishment at the first eunuch consul in Roman history, now showered him with curses at every turn. Courtiers, once eager for his attention, now shunned him with the same fervor with which they had previously flattered him. At a meeting of the imperial council, Empress Eudoxia delivered the decisive blow. She presented Arcadius with petitions from generals, senators, and ordinary citizens, all attributing the empire's misfortunes to Eutropius. The emperor, gripped by fear of losing his throne and convinced that the salvation of the state required a sacrifice, made a ruthless decision. The eunuch was immediately stripped of all posts and titles, his colossal property confiscated, and he himself was banished from the lavish palace he had so long controlled. The fall was as swift as the ascent. Within hours, Eutropius transformed from the most influential man in the East into a wretched outcast. In despair, he sought refuge in the Hagia Sophia, clinging to the sacred altar. There, in the shadow of the magnificent mosaics, he pleaded for the right of church sanctuary, the only tradition capable of halting imperial wrath. He spent several days in the temple, surrounded by soldiers, awaiting orders for his arrest. The spectacle was truly paradoxical. A man who had skillfully manipulated laws and customs to achieve unimaginable power now depended on those very traditions to save his life. In the corridors of the imperial palace, Eudoxia, driven by cold calculation, persistently sought the agreement of Patriarch John Chrysostom to a compromise solution that would allow Eutropius to be punished without violating the inviolability of sacred sanctuary. After lengthy negotiations, it was decided to exile the disgraced dignitary to Cyprus. Eutropius, grasping at this straw, understood, however, that exile was not an act of mercy, but merely an ominous prelude to an even more tragic fate. At first glance, exile to Cyprus might have seemed a dignified end to the career of a man who had risen from the lowest ranks. On this island, renowned for its serene beauty and ancient temples, Eutropius was expected to live far from the power intrigues of Constantinople, where he had once played a leading role. However, loneliness and humiliation quickly began to gnaw at his soul. News from the capital was unbearable. Eudoxia shone like a bright star as the true ruler, while Eutropius's name was cursed in the squares and taverns. Unable to reconcile himself with his insignificance, he made a fatal error. He fled Cyprus and took refuge in the camp of Tribigild, the very barbarian chieftain whose rebellion had hastened his downfall. A cruel twist of fate caught up with Eutropius. The man once accused of failing to keep the barbarian tribes in check now voluntarily surrendered to them, offering his knowledge and secrets as payment for his own salvation. Tribigild, the barbarian leader, received him with caution, but quickly realized the value the former consul of the empire represented in his camp. Eutropius possessed information about supply routes, knew all the intricacies of palace intrigues and the weaknesses of Roman military commanders. News of this alliance instantly reached Constantinople, sparking a storm of indignation. Emperor Arcadius, who had once shown mercy by sending him into exile, now felt the betrayal as a personal wound. Eutropius ceased to be merely a disgraced courtier. He became the state's most bitter enemy. The imperial decree declared Eutropius a traitor, and a generous reward was offered for his capture, dead or alive. The eunuch's fate was sealed. After Tribigild's death, who fell at the hands of his own tribesmen, bribed by imperial agents, the rebels' allies handed Eutropius over in chains in exchange for a pardon. The man who had once paraded through Constantinople in a purple consular robe now returned to the capital as a prisoner, amidst a hail of mockery and contemptuous glances. The trial was swift and exemplary. No one dared to speak in his defense. Eutropius was accused of treason, conspiracy, and corruption. The verdict rang out like a thunderclap, marking the inglorious end of a career full of intrigue and ambition. Eutropius, once the emperor's all-powerful favorite, was sentenced to public execution, which took place in the Hippodrome of Constantinople, the very place where he had once celebrated his political triumphs with jubilation. In January 401, under the watchful eyes of an enraged crowd, the executioner severed his head. The people, who had only recently trembled before his might, now welcomed his fall with cheers, watching his head roll across the blood-stained ground. The name of Eutropius has forever served as a cautionary tale for future generations. No power, however absolute it might appear, can last indefinitely. In an effort to prevent any recurrence of such a precedent, the Senate enacted a series of laws that permanently barred eunuchs from holding consular positions, thereby legally codifying the exceptional case that Eutropius represented. His meteoric rise and tragic downfall became a stark lesson on the perils of unbridled ambition and the inherent fragility of power built on intrigue and manipulation.